Hello guys, today I'm going to be showing you how you can make your own Pokeball plugin for Minecraft. Let's get right to it then. We're going to be using a few events today. I'll go ahead and explain each one as we go. So the first step here is to get the actual Pokeball. So whenever a player throws a snowball at an entity, we want to capture the entity and put them inside of the snowball. I'm not going to be saving an exact copy of the entity today, but I'm going to save the type of entity so we can spawn the same type of entity later. So I'm going to be using a snowball today as our Pokeball, and if you want to make this even more nice, you can go ahead and add a custom resource pack to your server and make the snowball appear as a Pokeball, but I'm not going to be doing this today. So let's go ahead and do a couple of checks here. The first thing we want to do is to make sure our projectile is a snowball. And after this, we want to make sure that the snowball is hitting another entity. And then we want to make sure that the entity is not a player because we cannot capture and spawn another player. We're going to be using persistent data to store the entity type. If you don't know how to use the persistent data API or would just like to know more, I will have a card on screen and a link in the description taking you to a video explaining how the persistent data API works. Next thing we're going to do is create a namespace key for us to use here, and I'm going to go ahead and define this up on the class level so that we can use it inside of all of our methods. And after we've defined that, we can go ahead and use it. So the first thing we want to do is make sure our snowball does not have this key, because if it does have the key, that means it already contains an entity and it is not going to be able to hold another one. After this, we can create a new item, set the persistent data, and give it to the player, as well as kill the entity that the snowball has hit. And there's all the code done for capturing an entity. If you guys have been following along with this tutorial series, you should know most of these things here, so I'm only going to go over a couple of them. To get the entity that our snowball has hit, you can go ahead and use this method from the event. And to get the player from the event, you have to get the projectile entity, and then you can get the shooter from that. And of course, to remove the entity, you just get the entity and use the method .remove. Now let's go ahead and write the code for whenever the player wants to release the entity. We're going to create an else at the end of this if statement. Before we can write the code to actually release the entity, we have to set the persistent data to the projectile. Because what we did up here is we created an item and we added a persistent data container to it. But the problem is, whenever you throw a snowball, it turns in from an item to an entity. So you have to get the data whenever the player throws the item inside of the interact event, and then you have to set the data whenever the player throws the projectile inside of the projectile launch event. So we're going to go ahead and do the interact event first because that's the order that it occurs in. So you want to check if the item that the player is interacting with is not equal to null. Alright, and you guys have seen me write this code 1,000 times before, so I'm not going to go over it again. So we know for sure at this point that the player is holding one of our Pokeballs, so we can go ahead and get the type from the persistent data and add it to a hash map that I'm about to create. I'm going to go ahead up here to the top level of our class and create another variable that's going to be a hash map of all the players that have thrown an item, but it has not yet become a projectile. Now we can go ahead and add a player to that cache. Now we have the entity type stored along with the player's unique ID, which we can use to get the entity type inside of the projectile launch event. So now in here we want to make sure that the shooter that is shooting the entity is an instance of a player like we did above inside of the projectile hit event. Then make sure that the projectile is a snowball. Then we can go ahead and retrieve the entity type from the cache and update the persistent data of the entity. And there's all the code for the projectile launch event done. Now that the projectile contains the entity type, we can go ahead and spawn it whenever the projectile collides with a block. So we can go ahead and get the persistent data of the entity thrown, and then we want to make sure that the entity has our namespace key. I'm going to go ahead and move the location up by 1 block so that the entity does not get spawned in the floor. We can go ahead and spawn the entity into the world using this method here. And that's all the code. Then I'll go ahead and show you guys what this looks like in game. You can see here whenever I get myself a snowball and throw it at an entity, it will pop right into my inventory, and you can see it has the name Pokeball, and whenever we throw it, you can see it spawns the entity that we captured. In this case, it was a creeper. If this tutorial was a little bit fast-paced, that is because if I explained every single detail of this, we would be here for 30 minutes, and I just wanted to show you guys the general gist of it because I know you guys are smart and you can figure this out yourselves. If you want a closer look at what I did here, I will have a link to the project file in the description, and if you need any help, feel free to come over and join my Discord. Link is also down in the description. And that's all for today. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.
Nice! The mutt's nuts, in fact.